Well, I was recruited to the University of Washington. I arrived in 1987, but I think the recruitment process took about a year and a half, and I had been involved. I was mid-career at that time, and I had a number of administrative duties. And so I think I was hired to rejuvenate the center at that time. So I arrived in the fall of 1987 and served as director from 87 to 95, I think. Um, and so it was an important part of my career. It's the first time I had um, been the director of a demography center. I had done interim jobs, but that was um, first time I had done that. How did it have an impact on my career? I was very important. I had I was full of ideas, and the center faculty were ready for many of them, and so I got to implement a lot of the ideas I had at the time. And I could go into detail about those, but it was an important stage of my life. I felt that I could exercise a lot of my imagination about organizations, as well as having a venue for um, doing good research.
I was a professor in the Evans School of Public Policy, so not sociology, but my interests were in social demography. Was an expert in poverty and American social policy. So I'd heard about the Demography Center, but I didn't know much about it. And Charlie Hirschman got to the university, I believe it was 1987, as the new director. And he told me about it, invited me, and that's really what got me started. Uh, and I didn't even know there was a field called social demography at the time. So, but my work over the years really has fit into that category. And I liked it from the start because I've always been an interdisciplinary kind of guy or multidisciplinary kind of scholar. And here was a chance to work with folks in sociology, especially. And it's just intellectually very interesting. Intellectual stimulation, of course, it's hard to pinpoint exactly how that affected my work, but I'm sure it did in terms of the questions I asked and the advice I was able to get from people, and also the computing facilities. So on the research side, I know it mattered, but I couldn't give any specifics. On the other side, of course, it was just fundamental because as you know, I became director in 1997, and that became the center of my life for 5 years. And I found that challenging and interesting and sometimes tiring, but always stimulating. And being director led to me starting this population leadership program, which continued until around 2007. So the administrative side of CSD had a huge impact on my life as well. The thing I did in my career was start the population leadership program and be involved with it, because it brought in fellows from around the world, and it gave me travel opportunities around the world that I never imagined I would have, and all focused on improving reproductive health, which is a passion. I mean, I think it's passionately important, and was just so thrilled to be able to be part of that program. And I say still now, 2025, I think when I think back of my entire career, that was probably the most interesting thing I did, and the most impactful to my own person. And so.
So the offer of becoming CSDE director was part of how I was recruited to the University of Washington from Penn State. And what I realized was, essentially, without the really rapid evolution of CSDE into a fully fledged population center, a functional population center, I wouldn't have been able to obtain the independent research funding that made my career possible. So what CSDE did was they provided really key administrative and computing support that in turn allowed me to establish this interdisciplinary team of scientists focused on key questions of how epidemics spread in human populations and how they can be controlled. It turned out that answering the questions required the development of this new statistical methodology for analyzing and simulating network data. So, as they say, we were building the plane as we were flying it. And really what that required was this incredible interdisciplinary space. And that's what CSDE created, was an interdisciplinary, interdepartmental scientific environment.
In the end, I was at the University of Washington for 26 years. And I first arrived as an assistant professor, and I was a labor economist. That was what I did. I was an economist, period. And I think it took quite a few years before I started becoming associated with CSDE. And it would have been while Charlie Hirschman was the director, because Charlie put a big push on reaching out beyond the sociology department. And at the time, I had a colleague named Bob Pollock, whom I collaborated with pretty extensively over the years. And he and Charlie, I think, got talking. Bob's always been someone who is interested in the fringes of economics and sort of stretching out the kinds of things we think about. And it was really Bob who pulled me in to CSDE, who encouraged me to start going to the seminars. And I was hooked within a couple of years. And it took a while to understand that seminars outside economics are a bit different. So the habit at the time was to wait until the end of the speaker's presentation before you asked questions. And in economics, that's not the way it goes. I should note that by the time Bob and I were really closely connected to CSDE for a few years, the people who interrupted seminars first were Stu Toney and Charlie Hirschman. And so we infiltrated CSDE. And actually, I think the seminar style at CSDE evolved while I was there anyway. I'm not sure what it's like these days, but it became pretty free and easy, and with lots of sort of interruptions and questions in the middle. And I think I found going to the CSDE seminars really revelatory. Just seeing how people in other fields thought about the topics that I was interested in anyway, sort of work, health, how families operate, and so on, was really a broadening experience for me. And I think I sort of slowly moved into starting to call myself a demographer. So it changed the work that I did. It changed the literatures that I read. And it let me develop a bit of a reputation for being an economist who didn't immediately piss off all the sociologists. So you learn to be more respectful, I think, than economists had a reputation for being. So it changed me enormously. I started going to the Population Association meetings. I served on their executive committee for a while. I was vice president of the Association of Population Centers. So I really became sort of fully embedded in the demography community in a way that is the source of my warm, fuzzy feelings that I mentioned. I really felt at home in the demography community. And it's what got me my current job. And so I came to UCSB as part of a demography initiative. The dean of social sciences at the time was Melvin Oliver, a very well-known scholar of race and racial discrepancies in health. And he really wanted to build a pop center and had managed to convince a donor to agree with an endowment, right, that would both endow a professorship and a small center. And so I was responding to a search for the Leonard Broom Professor of Demography. And I think Melvin's idea was that he was going to sort of shift sociology in a more quantitative direction, but somehow it didn't turn out that way in the end. And for that, I'm very grateful. And certainly my history with CSDE and my ability to get letters of recommendation from both sociologists, demographers, and economists was what got me this job. And I've been extremely happy here. So I owe a lot to CSDE. CSDE clearly shaped my career and my research outlook in a really fundamental way.
I was recruited. I was happily employed at UCLA, but I just got married, and so I was recruitable. And I think because my wife was at the University of Toronto. So this is a personal story about tide migration, very much related to my own research interest. And we were very happy at the prospect of both of us living in LA, or even better, living in Toronto. And along came a recruitment from UW because Dean, I forget the name of the Dean, had pumped money into the expansion of the center. I think this is also the story for Martina. And it's certainly the story for other people at CSD at the time. The idea was to grow the center and make it more competitive in terms of applications for national money. It has been an extraordinary success. It certainly was an example of just a little bit of money goes a long way. And so there was recruitments in anthropology, sociology, and geography. It was a collaborative interdepartmental hiring initiative in which everybody really participated. And I can remember that's when I first met Bob Plotnick. He was a person I went out to dinner with. And so that was my first contact with CSDE. And everybody was working out the relationship at the time between centers and departments, as they still are. But they try to figure out, well, to what extent do departments have a say, and to what extent does the center have a say in hiring and money, all of those sorts of things. So that's my first connection, and there's a lot of other detail that goes along with it, with the hiring of my other half, and I think it was 18 months from my interview before I actually showed up here. But yeah, and my first office, because they hadn't prepared a space for me in Smith Hall, which is where geography is, my home department. My first office was in the basement of the old Savory Hall where CSD was. My first office was in the old CSD in Savory. In the basement. I'm going to try and channel the Big Lebowski here and promote brevity. It's been enormously important for me in terms of supporting my work, in terms of being a forum for my work, in terms of colleagues, support from colleagues, professional and personal. In terms of experiences, positive and negative, in terms of developing programs, understanding the institution, leading the center, understanding NIH, all of those things were so important to me. Learning how an institution works, and quite frankly, departments are quite narrow, disciplinary kind of collections of people. And the thing about being associated with CSDE is I got to meet so many smart people across campus, and it made me much less parochial in my outlook on social science. And so much so that I feel much less kind of bound to the disciplinary tradition than which I came.
So I got my PhD in 1972. My first job was at Duke University in North Carolina, and I was there for 9 years with a sabbatical during that time. And I had been involved with the Demography Center there, both at Wisconsin when I was a graduate student and also at Duke. And in 1981, I was recruited to Cornell University, which also had a population program, and I was involved with at Duke, it was with George Myers, who was the director. At Cornell, it was Joe Stikos. But I was involved in sort of running lots of things, the the seminar series and advising graduate students and teaching the core courses and things like that. So I had done that. I stepped down from being the director. Actually, I got kicked upstairs. I was asked to chair the Department of Sociology, and I had long wanted to have a transition in leadership. I felt that there are two types of center directors: those who got appointed as a director of a research institute and spent their entire career in that role. I believed in the model of a rotating directorship, of which people come in, try all their ideas out, implement them or fail to implement them, and then they move on to other stages of their career, thinking that the rejuvenation of one's career, the rejuvenation of centers, is important, that these jobs not be career appointment type of things. And I was in danger, I think, of being expected to stay on forever. But I got asked to chair the Department of Sociology, and that was kind of a convenient excuse. And so I could talk my longtime colleague, Pete Guest, who should have been the director many years prior to that, to assume the directorship, which he did, and he did a fine job. What did you do after that? Well, I continued to be very involved in the center life of the center as a director emeritus. There were times during my subsequent career, I think this is from the late 1990s all up until I retired in 2017, I considered leaving the University of Washington to go run population centers at other universities, and eventually I decided not to. I stayed here. I retired in 2017, and I'm doing lots of things, but not involved in the active life of the center at the present time.
So I came to the university in 1984, and I believe it was in 1989, the new dean of the Evans School, it was called back then the Graduate School of Public Affairs, asked me to be the associate dean, basically for curriculum and faculty. We were a very small school, only 15 or so faculty. So I got my first taste of administration, and I was the associate dean until 1996, went on sabbatical for a year to part of the time was in Australia. And during that time, there was a transition. Pete was stepping down, Pete Guest was stepping down. And I liked the academic administration. I thought it might be interesting. So I wrote a note to the recruiting committee about why I would be interested and why I thought I could do it. And they picked me. I remember telling them, I think I know how to get things done in an academic environment. And I thought that was true, and I think it was true. What the timing, I think that choosing me it may have been deliberate to choose someone not from sociology, because that was the year the center moved out of sociology and into arts and sciences. And so it would be easier to do that if someone wasn't from the sociology department and have to face his or her colleagues about, you've taken this very wonderful center away from us. But I was not only from a different discipline, I was from a different unit on campus. So it made it very clear to the entire university that this now was a separate center in arts and sciences. It was going to be multidisciplinary. I mean, it's always multidisciplinary, but much less heavily sociology. And that got it going. And I think a lot of this was due to Charlie Hirschman at the time. One of the deals he made as I was taking over was to hire 3 new faculty affiliates. And we had a big search across multiple departments and hired folks in geography and anthropology, as well as sociology and statistics, that really set a new direction in terms of, we're going to broaden the center in a very conscious way. So it became public affairs, it became social work, geography, some of which were somewhat represented, but they became more central to the place. And since I left, even more so, going down to the south, the medical side of things, the public health folks. And so I think 1977 was a watershed year for the center. When I finished the center, 1992, went back to the Evans School as a faculty member, but I continued as director of this population leadership program. And since that was administered through the center, of course, stayed involved with it. And since then, after the program ended, which was, I think, 2007, I went back to basically being a regular professor of public policy, continued my work in poverty and anti-poverty policy, continued on CSD committees, and participating in the intellectual life of the community. And then toward the end of my career, I again took on a job as associate dean for academic affairs at the Evans School, and was there for, I think, 2012 to 2016, and retired the year after that.
Okay. So I was director from 2002 when we got the center grant to 2006 when I handed it over to Shelly. And what I was doing before my first job after graduate school was on the sociology faculty at Columbia University. And I left there for Penn State with a tenure joint appointment in sociology and statistics in 1996. The move was in large part because I had just been awarded an NIH research grant, and I had some foundation research support over those previous years as well. And Columbia didn't have a population center. They really didn't have any kind of a research center where you could get your grants administered and where you would have any kind of support. So I had no administrative support, no institutional support for getting the proposals out or accomplishing the grant-related work. I mean, it was there I was with these great research awards, and it was like, I can't do them here. So the grants, really what they did was they also helped me to establish connections with researchers at other universities. And many of those did, in fact, have established population centers. So that's when I really saw how valuable a resource that was. And when I went to Penn State, I immediately became an affiliate of the Penn State Population Center during my time. I was involved in the Population Center at the University of Pennsylvania, different place. Penn State, University of Pennsylvania. People sometimes get those confused, but they're quite different. Because I took a sabbatical semester there at the University of Pennsylvania just before coming to UW, so in between in that transition. I also participated during that time in an NIH consultation on envisioning the population centers of the future. So in the process of all of this, I learned a lot about how a well-run demography center can serve faculty, postdocs, research scientists, and students, and how different variations in the center structure, its institutional location, its governance, and physical space could all establish a unique foundation for interdisciplinary collaboration. So that's what I was doing before I got here. What did I do after? I was deeply involved in another one of UW's interdisciplinary centers, the Center for AIDS and STD, CFAS is what we called it, sometimes CFAR. Indeed, that center was actually one of the main draws for me in coming to the UW in the first place. So the year after leading the CSDE Center Grant application, I worked on the CFAS Center Grant renewal, and I think that was, it might have been their 5th renewal. They'd been in place for 25 years already, I think, at that point. So they were very established and huge, and the amount of money that they were talking about was like completely a different animal than what we were doing at CSDE. But what I did was I worked on the renewal for their proposal, and I proposed a new core for them that was focused on socio-behavioral research for HIV prevention. So I became the founding director of that core because it was successful, the proposal, and I continued in that position for 15 years. I also briefly led the effort to establish a CFAS core that was focused on mathematical modeling for HIV epidemiology and recruited the faculty who then went on to lead that. But the other big thing I did, which was great, was I returned to my research. When I first come to UW, Professor Mark Hancock and I had established an interdisciplinary research group called the Network Modeling Group, which, and you know, Steve was part of that. Steve actually, I met Steve at Penn State, by the way, so there's that connection there. And Anyway, so Steve was part of that network modeling group. So when he said I was busy, that's probably all he saw from 2002 to 2006 was I was busy every day, all day, right? But finally, after I put down the directorship, I was able to get back to that, which was great. And from 2010 until I retired, I co-led this group with Steve Goodrow. And from it, we launched many successful NIH grant proposals. We mentored lots of graduate students and postdocs from a bunch of different fields: sociology, anthropology, statistics, epidemiology, nursing, mathematics. It was kind of remarkable, actually, mathematical biology, partly because CSDE was this beautiful home for all of this, that we could do that. To discuss research in progress, some of the students that we mentored have gone on to make really foundational contributions in their fields, and a number of them have continued to work with us, which is great. So I would say this work resulted in your traditional academic output, so like published papers and books, but we were also committed to the production of public goods for others. And I think that's probably the most important legacy of our research group. Open source software is a big piece of this legacy. We have an award-winning package for statistical analysis of network data that implements basically all the theoretical progress and contributions that were made by the research team, and makes it available then to others to use. And another very popular package for modeling epidemics on networks called EpiModel that is essentially mostly developed by one of our students, and he continues to maintain it. So we have a lot of online training materials and annual workshops that we teach both here and abroad. I think that's also part of the legacy of our group. And we continue to teach the new methods basically to an international cadre of scholars at this point. So that's part of what I'm doing. I think we were really lucky, I just want to highlight this, to be working on these things just as the movement for transparent, reproducible research was taking off. Thing about the way you work, right? And in a really good way. The tools that have been developed to facilitate the open sharing of research data, code, and text in the past 20 years are truly amazing. And it's changed the way we do and share science. And again, if it hadn't been for CSDE, I don't think we would have been able to take advantage of those tools in the way that we were, because especially in the computing core, but not just the computing core, we had real support for making sure that we could make the transitions and learn about the new stuff. And it frequently required like the computing core to learn a whole bunch of stuff then as well. So it was a really interesting process, really enjoyable. So what I'm doing now, I split my time between academic work and community political work. I continue to teach workshops and build out the supporting materials for our software. That's something I thoroughly enjoy, especially with the luxury of time I have now. And I keep prodding Steve because he can't wait to get to that point. I particularly enjoy actually staying up to date with the new tools in the reproducible research chain because they continue to evolve, and they're just great. So on the political side, I'm involved with a statewide coalition of community groups that's working to improve police practices, encouraging things like de-escalation and strengthening accountability through legislative reform. We had a number of big wins. As an example, we had over a dozen reform bills that were passed by the Washington State Legislature in 2021. So that's a big deal, right? That was great. And of course, we've had some setbacks. For example, there's been a rollback of the reforms that we introduced for police vehicular pursuits in 2021. The net result has been an explosion in the number of people killed. So as you might expect, I'm the person who does the numbers for them. And I use this whole reproducible tool chain to make a data set available on the number of people killed during fatal encounters with police in Washington State, and also a report. That again, I'm using all those tools that I learned to put that report together. Fun fact, not so fun, more than half of the people killed during police vehicular pursuits are bystanders. Right, which is why we wanted the pursuit reforms. And often they're pursuing somebody for a tail light that's out, or expired tags, or shoplifting. And in the result, somebody's grandmother gets killed. I mean, it makes no sense, right? It's common sense to have some real basic kind of guardrails in there about when you use that particular form of behavior. Anyway, so that's the stuff I do on the side, which is all the time now.
But somebody had to take over because the center grant and the training grant were running out, and new proposals had to be written. And so I'm not a happy administrator, and I really did not want this job. But I think what I've described is I felt a real sense of obligation to CSDE. And it seemed to me that if I could devote a couple of years to this, I could sort of get us through this rough spot and then turn it over to somebody else. So I spent the good part of 2005, 2006, basically writing those grant proposals in my basement. I didn't have space at Raid Hall. I didn't have much in the way of support from the staff who were still working for the current director. And it was a difficult thing to put together. I obviously had the support of my colleagues, the other CSDE affiliates, but I really did not have much in the way of institutional support while I put those grant proposals together. And then I guess, succeeded to the director's position either December 2006 or January 2007. I've sort of forgotten. So then we sort of bumbled through for about a year and a half. And then I went on leave to take a fellowship at the Russell Sage Foundation. And so spent 2008, 2009 as the economy was melting down in Manhattan, which was also a really interesting experience. My husband, who's also an economist, was visiting at the New York Fed at the time, where no one was allowed to talk to him because financial markets were melting down and secret things were going on. So it was a fascinating year to be away, but Russell Sage is a wonderful place to be. And then I came back for a final year as director, having let it be known that this was it, and there needed to be a new director. And Mark Ellis, who had brilliantly sort of taken over as acting director while I was in New York, was willing to take over the position at that point. And then, it was a wonderful choice. I'm sure he did great. And then a few months later, I left for UCSB. And so that's my career. I think that the things that I really concentrated on when I was director, apart from just sort of keeping steady on the road, was the seminar series, which was always sort of a really major focus of my interest. I always thought it was the heart of CSDE. It's when we all got together. And so I really, really enjoyed, taking a real active role in keeping the seminar series going and bringing in interesting people.
Okay, so I was the director for 6 years. A year when, I think 2008 to 2009, when Shelly Lundberg was on sabbatical. She came back for a year after that, and then she finished her term and left for UC Santa Barbara, which was a big loss for CSDE. And then I took on a full term as regular director as opposed to acting director from 2010 to 2015. Before I became acting director for the first time, I had been training director. I wasn't all the way up to my first term as director. When I arrived in 1999 was when I started at the University of Washington. There was no center grant. There was no training grant. There was just money from, is it from the Mellon Foundation or from Hewlett. It was Hewlett money, and it was supporting all of these international trainees. And it was great. I thought, wow, sort of foundation was providing this money. But as CSD grew and there was this transition from Bob Plotnick as director to Martina Morris as director, there was this push for federal money. This was the movement of a painful movement, but one that had to happen out of sociology into a kind of an independent center based in Wright Hall. And this happened with the transition from Bob Plotnick to Martina Morris. I think it was well handled from my perspective, but I'm sure there was some sore feelings about the loss of sociology's control. But part of the deal is that reviews had come back from big NIH grants saying sociology had too much control, it needs to be independent. And so that was part of the initiative that hired me, was to bring in people from other departments and also to expand the reach of the center across many departments. So Martina became director as part of all of that. And there was this application. Martina and Bob led this application for a training grant, which went in first. That came back, and I was appointed training director. And then a center grant went in, and that provided additional money later on. But so I became the training director, and I was the training director, I think, from 2001 to 2005. Nobody really knew how to do any of this when I started. We just didn't know anything. And I was so naive in negotiating with my chair and with deans and with Martina about who would pay for release time or support anything, so much so that in the end I got squeezed and didn't get anything. Okay, so after I became director, I went on sabbatical for the best part of 2 years, and kind of that was great. And then I was thinking about returning to the department and thinking everything would be just a simple research and teaching career. And nothing ever turned out that way. So basically, I've been ducking and weaving, trying to avoid future administrative responsibilities for the remainder of my career. So far, relatively successful at that.
I suppose the other thing, population centers are kind of synonymous with having weekly seminar series. And this had stopped a number of years before, and there was no way for which people to get together to talk. I feel that a center, to be meaningful, has to be an interacting community. People have to talk to each other formally and informally as well. So drawing upon my other experience, I tried to get the demography faculty, which was a small group, less than about 10 or 15 people. We reserved a table at the faculty club every week, so we would all have lunch together. Then we would go and have the demography seminar. And I tried to, prolong the seminar series by having a wine and sherry hour afterwards. That kind of flopped, but the luncheon kind of continued, though that after a while the center just got too big to be able to create that kind of Gemeinschaft kind of atmosphere amongst faculty members in the center. So I think having a lively seminar series was one of the things that I was very pleased of. Also, rather than to centralize ideas in one person, the director or another person, to try to diffuse responsibility as broadly as I could. So anytime anybody showed any interest in population or was responsive to whatever I asked them for their involvement, I put them in charge of something rather than just sort of allow them to be asked to do things, saying, well, here's the budget, here's the seminar series, put it together next year, whatever you want to do. Literally, they did. The same thing with fellowship selection committees, review of applicants to be faculty associates and so on, just try to put everybody in charge of something so they had responsibility and felt sense of not only of participation, but of ownership of the programs in the center. So those are the things I think I did, and I think most of those have continued. What do I miss about the center? I've never left, so I haven't missed anything. I've been very proud of my association and remaining close to it.
I found the intellectual interchange is very stimulating. As I say, I'm an economist by background, but I always had an interest in multidisciplinary work. Before I was at UW, I worked with a political scientist. And I came out, worked at Wisconsin for several years in their poverty center, which had a lot of folks in sociology and demography in particular, and of course, economics, political science. So I always loved the interdisciplinary and multidisciplinary aspect of the center. And that's really, I think, looking back from 1987 to 2017 is the theme that probably is most important to me.
I think one of the things I liked best was actually writing up the proposal for the center back in 2001. It was incredibly stressful. If you've ever been involved in one of these, you know, right? But at the same time, it was so much fun to be able to think creatively and work together with other people to come up with a vision for what a center like CSDE can be and what it can offer to its affiliates and what kind of research it can offer to the world. I mean, it was really that part of it. If you can, you know, can deal with the adrenaline, that part of it is really a joy. I also, though, miss working with staff, people like Matt Dunbar, and faculty to implement the vision. It was really, again, when it wasn't like a total, it was actually fun to troubleshoot problems, figure out solutions to things, because there were the staff that have worked at CSDE over the years have been so smart and so good and so dedicated. It is such a joy to work with them. To figure things out. So,
well, I think that yes, it was the seminars. I mean, it was I love the staff also, obviously, but it was really the seminars and the interactions between the affiliates and so on. I think that the thing that I learned, the other thing I learned from CSDE was the special role that a population research center plays both in universities and in the social sciences. And I think that's one thing that I have brought here. It's been highlighted by conversations that I've had here with our current social science dean, who doesn't get it, and who is always trying to push our pop center into, for example, declaring a major theme every year that we're going to work on. He really wants to, have, community stakeholders and work on sexy topics and so on. And I keep on trying to convince him that what a population research center does is provide services, is support the individual researchers and research teams that are out there doing the work that they want to do. And it's not our job to direct what people are doing in what we think is a sexy research area that will, get good headlines in the community. And so that is what I learned at CSDE, that what CSDE does is support brilliant researchers, the training of the next generation of brilliant researchers, and so on. And so that's, for me, what I learned.
I was going to ask you, Shelly, so from my perspective, I didn't know about the 2005, 2006 experience for you. I was sort of blissfully unaware. That was my first year. That was my first year at UW, and I felt very supported when I arrived at UW, and especially by CSDE. So I remember you pulled me in, I think it was 2007 or something, to be associate director or something like that, or training director. I can't remember exactly.
Training director, Sarah, but I think
Yeah.
I've established my memories are very hazy.
But I do remember, I was wondering if you might talk about the search, the decision to go with the search to hire Matt, the initiative. I felt like that was something that you were creative, because also under your watch, Mark got the funding for the RDC. And so we had these two kind of big initiatives that set us on a new path, very much along the lines of what you were just suggesting, service-oriented, facilitating the research of faculty.
Well, I've got to confess that I have very imperfect memories of the GIS initiative. It was clear that spatial analysis was the coming thing, that people needed to be able to learn how to use it and how to both understand what was going on and actually employ it themselves. And so it just seemed like an obvious way to go. But in terms of I think that that's been borne out, definitely. I should say, relevant to this, our geography department here at UCSB, which is completely different from the geography department at UW, has a big group of demographers in it. They are actually in the hard sciences. The geography is not located in the social sciences, but they have this fantastic group of demographers, including, you may remember, Susie Castles, who is now the director of our Population Research Center.
Yeah.
And Susie is in the geography department, although she is clearly a central demographer. So I don't remember, and obviously there's tons and tons of spatial analysis of various sorts going on in that department, and it's closely connected to the work that we're doing here in the Broome Center. But I don't remember the details. I think, yeah, that's right. The RDC stuff was really just getting started while I was director, and certainly Mark is the one that brought that to fruition. It was clear that the distance from Seattle to the nearest RDC was a huge roadblock for our researchers in terms of getting their work done. And with a big university like the University of Washington, it seemed clear that there should be an adequate constituency to support an RDC in Seattle. And I think that during my last year as director, it was really a question of sort of pulling that, identifying and pulling together that constituency in that community to really get the project rolling.
Right. So favorite thing about being at CSD, meeting an incredible range of people across campus. I mean, really, 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 that was, people down in public health, or people over in social work, or people I mean, I remember when people first arrived over in the College of the Built Environment in the new real estate program and realizing what they were doing. That was so interesting to me. It's like, wow, I would never have met these people without being the director. And that really did open up the university to me. Nothing else, I think. I mean, there were sort of, administrative reorganizations. I don't really want to talk about those. I mean, it's not something that I think of as being central to my career. It did change things, but it's not something that, I mean, intellectually, the center just basically gave me opportunities that opened up to sort of doors for me to think about who to work with and so on and so forth. And it led very much to me working with a range of sociology graduate students, one of whom I collaborate with right now, Brad Foster, who is still employed by the Census Bureau. And and as a consequence of all of that and RDC work, I mean, I was one of the first external researchers to get access to IRS migration data. I mean that there's a line through CSDE that allowed that to happen. That wouldn't have happened without the trajectory I've been on.
Well, I think in part it was to creating an interdisciplinary program. That at that time the center was largely in the Department of Sociology. There were 3 or 4 people who had strongly identified with the center, and the center had kind of grown not moribund, but it was kind of insular, looking in, seeing demography as a unit within the Department of Sociology. Where in fact there were a lot of people who were doing population research across the University of Washington campus. So I took as my mission to try to bring a lot of those people in. For example, Dick Morrow was a population geographer in the Department of Geography, and he had a very long distinguished career training, I think they would call them social demographers or population geographers, and to get him and David Hodge, who later becomes the Dean of the College of Arts and Sciences, involved. There were also people in economics, Shelly Lundberg, Bob Plotnick. He was actually in other departments, but he was an economist, Anil Deolalekar. Sue Hanley was a social historian in the Jackson School, but her work was clearly demographic and large concerns, and many of these people were excited to be asked. Social work was another area. We had several faculty members who were graduates of the Department of Sociology and had demographers on their committee, and they were doing research on adolescent sexuality and other kinds of social problems, but very much influenced by a population kind of perspective. So I think I helped to create an interdisciplinary program. The other part was trying to get external funding for the center. There had been, all the external funding had sort of dried up by this time. And because I was in the middle stages of my career, I sort of knew all the players in the field. So I managed to get, within a year or two, get grants from the Hewlett and Mellon Foundation, particularly to expand our work in international demography and also anthropology. Mellon had a really strong interest in linking anthropology and sociology, and there were several anthropologists. Donna Leonetti was one of them, and a few others, to try to bring them into the program. This brought in funded graduate students. This brought in a number of postdoctoral fellows as well. The other area that I was both personally involved in, and I tried to influence the center, was to make it more international. The program with Pete Guest and Jim McCann and others was largely focused on American issues. Bill Lavely was not. He was a China demographer, but I was working on Southeast Asia, and so we tried to create a lot more recruitment of international graduate students and make the center, more taking advantage of our geographical position, Seattle on the Pacific Rim, looking kind of outward to Japan, to China, to Southeast Asia, to make that part of our identity. I also tried to get funding from NICHD, which was the largest funder in the program. We did get a training grant. We did apply for center grant 2 times, and 2 times, we were the next school to be funded, but then we weren't. I was also very involved in the PAA program to stimulate more demographic funding from Congress. So I think this continues. PAA goes to lobby Congress. We don't use the word lobby. We use it to constituent visitations to do so. And I was very involved in that, particularly with the Washington State delegation, to try to get more funding. And it turns out we did expand the number of centers in the country through that effort, but they went to other schools rather than us. So they have Washington State senators to thank for expanding the number of funded centers, even though the funding went to a couple of other institutions. But anyhow, soon after I finished being a director, we got the center grant and have held it ever since. So those are the kinds of things I did.
Of course, the big one, and I realize that in terms of the population program is really, I started it, it was run through the center, but it wasn't core to the center. It did provide funding to the center, overhead funding, and that was one of the motivations for seeking the grant. But during my time, thanks to the hiring initiative that Charlie sort of launched and other hires during the year, the goal was to finally get an NIH center grant, and also to get back the NIH training grant that I think we'd had at one time, but had lost it for a variety of reasons. I don't know why. So we built up the faculty, we built up the computing resources, we built up the grant portfolio, and with Martina Morris as my associate director, who had a very critical role in this, especially upgrading the computing, but also in thinking through what a center could be and should be, we applied for the training grant and we got it. And I think it was the next year we applied for the center grant and we got it. And that was huge cause of celebration. It was just a capstone of 10 years, not just me, but 10 years or so of work from the time Charlie got here to bring the center back to its glory days, if you will. And ever since then, we've had the center grant ever since, and it's just become one of these national powerhouses in demography that we'd hoped it would be. So getting the center grant and the training grant, it was a team effort. I happened to be the captain, but it was such a team effort, and couldn't have done it without the amazing affiliates I had to work with.
This is kind of a long answer, but keep in mind, I mean, CSDE did not have a center grant when I got here. So really, I had to build the whole thing. I had to write the proposal basically develop the proposal and then implement it, right? So there was a lot of institution building during those 4 years. So the first year at UW, this was before we had the center grant. I led the process of writing the center grant proposal. And CSDE, as you probably know, was initially a unit within the sociology department. You did know that, right? Yeah. The year before I got here, the deans had pulled it out. So CSDE had been funded by a center grant in earlier years, back in the 70s and early 80s, but had failed in the previous 2 attempts to have their center grant renewed. So there was a kind of, the morale was pretty low. There was no money. And essentially population science, as you know, it's a multidisciplinary endeavor. And as a center that was housed within the Department of Sociology, CSDE was really struggling to establish that kind of a presence on campus and to be competitive at the NIH level as a result. So as I said, the year before I arrived, the Arts and Sciences Dean had taken what was a very difficult but important step of pulling CSDE out of the Sociology Department and creating it as a freestanding unit within the Arts and Sciences Division. Also opened, however, the center up to true collaboration among faculty from other departments. The interdisciplinary collaboration that permitted became a key part of my strategy when writing up the proposal. And I think it was a key part of why we were successful. I found out from sort of back channel that our proposal in 2001 actually received the highest score of all the NIH Population Center grant proposals that we were competing against that year. So we came in #1, right? So that was great. What the proposal envisaged and what the funding allowed me to do was set up CSDE as a really unique resource for population research support in the Arts and Sciences Division. There was nothing like it at the time. At the heart of this was an administrative core that could facilitate both the submission of research proposals and the administration of successful awards, all these things that you take for granted now, right? The computing core that provided a dedicated staff, modern computing hardware. We actually provided all our own hardware to start, right? There wasn't the kind of systems that are available now that we could have just latched ourselves to, and specific software that's needed for advanced population research. We also had a development core that served as an incubator for the next generation of research proposals. All of this was stuff I had learned when I was at other research centers, basically other pop centers. And we established a methods core, which introduced this practice of hiring research scientists for consulting, whose time could be bought out by faculty who needed that specialized skill set. During my tenure as director, we also established a procedure for hiring CSDE affiliated faculty. I don't know if that procedure is still in place, but I wanted to at least mention it. But what we did was, because CSDE is not a department, it's not able to hire faculty directly. But without new faculty affiliates, CSDE is not going to thrive. I mean, there were affiliates from the existing, faculty pool, but we needed to be able to hire some of the best people for CSDE type research. And we weren't really able to do that. So while the dean's office had actually made CSDE affiliation for faculty members effectively revenue neutral for departments in terms of the indirect cost sharing, the department still didn't prioritize hiring new faculty that would become CSD affiliates. That wasn't their priority. Their top priority was usually, it was usually down there, maybe 5th or 6th, something like that. So maybe they'll be a good CSDE affiliate. So what we did was we designed a system for authorized CSDE searches. They'd be authorized at the dean's level, and the money would come from the dean's level. They were topic-based, interdisciplinary searches with a search committee comprised of members or comprising members from relevant departments for that topic. So one of the first things we did was a population and health for example. We did anthropology, sociology. We had somebody from public health, somebody from statistics. Steve Goodrow was one of the people we hired for that, right? So he came in through exactly that search process. The faculty member who was hired would then be located in a specific department, and then everything else is just like it always is for a faculty hire, right? They go through whatever procedure they go through there. So CSDE then just becomes the place where they're affiliated. And what this did was it kind of changed the prospect of hiring a CSDE faculty member, related faculty member, from a low priority to a competition for the best person. And for departments, it was essentially like, this is a free faculty member for you. If you get the best person in this search, they will come to your department, right? So it switched the whole incentive scheme around, and I think it turned out to be a very valuable tool. I sought to build mutually supportive relationships with other affiliated departments. One of the ways that I did this was by awarding a quarter of RA support funding to the department that submitted the most research funding proposals through CSDE. I also worked hard to establish relationships and collaborative activities like jointly sponsored workshops, external speakers with the schools of medicine and public health. Public health in particular deals with population sciences, and they have a strong established culture of funded research that provides many opportunities for collaboration. I think that type of collaboration has grown into and matured into one of CSDE's strongest pillars now. And I guided CSDE's physical move from where they was a couple of rooms in the basement of Savory, and not good rooms either. One of those rooms had no windows. I don't even know how you can call it a room. Anyway, we moved into the second floor of Wright Hall, which is where it is now. And that gave CSD room, obviously, to provide offices for support staff, research scientists, and population fellows. I made sure the kitchen was not removed from the front office. They really wanted to pull that out. And it's like, no, that's like the gathering place, right? What are you going to do without a kitchen? I secured space for what had been CSDE's physical library of books in the basement, I think, and we had to get space as well. I got space for the computing hardware, which was still our own, in the basement of another building. I think the kitchen is the only thing that's left now. The other two spaces have been repurposed. One of them, I don't think the computing space, which you wouldn't want anyway, it's a windowless room in a basement somewhere. But I lost one battle and it still stings. We had a competitor when moving into Wright. It was the newly established digital arts department. And there was this large double room-sized conference room on the second floor that would have allowed us to host the weekly CSDE seminar in our space. Would have been big enough for that. But digital arts wanted to have its own smaller conference room, and the dean split the baby because we were arguing about it, and they gave us, half of they split the room in half now. Half of it went to digital arts and half of it went to CSDE. And neither of those two rooms is particularly functional as far as I'm concerned. And we found other spaces on campus for the seminar, different ones over the years. I was always looking for a good space, but it never felt like our home. And the facilities were often less than ideal. And we didn't have control over the facility because it wasn't our space. And if you think about it, our affiliated faculty and students are spread around campus. So the seminar is really the one time that we all come together. So losing that room really felt like a real missed opportunity to create a dedicated place for our shared community. Even now, I mean, you could almost get me to tears about that. I really think that was such a shame that we didn't get that, and would have made a huge difference in the sense of community that CSDE was able to establish. Design and launch of CSDE's first real website. Now, you guys might find it hard to believe, but back in the early 2000s, websites were just getting started as the portal that connected an organization to its stakeholders. And I can still remember how excited we were when we were doing Google searches all the time. And the first time our CSDE came up as the top hit in a Google search, we got so excited, we actually sent an email. We took a screenshot and sent an email to NIH It's like we're on the map.
We sort of talked about the RDC, which I think was great to get going. No, I've got to say, I figure I got the Population Research Center grant in and the training grant in just before I took over as director, and that was my accomplishment. I'm not sure that I sort of did anything else massive apart from that and starting the RDC thing.
And there was a mandate to create courses and what we were going to do and how we were going to teach them. So it turns out it's very easy at UW to get a new course number and a new course kind of acronym. So I created the CSDE 501 series and all those other courses, and negotiated with sociology for that joint listing of the demographic methods course. So we created those courses. I taught the seminar, the sort of professional seminar series. I made it all up as I went along. I had no idea what professional development was. I basically, in a primitive sense, Googled it and came up with stuff, and that's what we did. And I think we're kind of locked into some of that stuff still going forward. It's evolved, but really there was not much out there. I spoke to some people in the med school who were friends who talked about what they did for various graduate programs, including doctors. So I did similar sorts of things. So that's where a lot of that came from. And then I ran that. We ran programs for evaluating applications for our new training program. And then, unfortunately, 2 or 3 years in, the Hewlett Foundation said they were no longer interested in supporting it. And so that was a big blow. We lost that money. And Bob, there was a kind of parallel program, the Population Fellows program, that was sort of in the training program, sort of not. That was Gates funded. But it was kind of an exciting time. We had great students, and some of them are coming back for the 75th anniversary. I mean, it's great. It kind of feels like a real, yeah. It's really grown, and to see how the training program grew after me. I mean, what Sarah did, creating the certificate program. I mean, fantastic. I mean, how many people now come into the program? It's been a huge success. It's just keeps growing and growing and growing. So I'm so happy I was part of that before I became director. Then I became director, and that was a crazy time, somewhat similar to now, in the sense that we're entering the biggest economic downturn probably since the Great Depression. And I thought, oh crap, what's going to happen here? Well, then the stimulus money came along, and the program officer at NIH reached out and said, you have to apply for money. We have so much money to disperse. And all of a sudden, we got a bunch of cash. I mean, I wrote a grant. We got it all. I should have asked for more. And along with that money came the possibility of hiring a GIS specialist. That's where the money came for hiring Matt Dunbar. So we had the plan for all of this, but now we had the cash. And I remember at the time, because I'm somewhat cautious financially, thinking, wait a minute, we have money for 3 years. How is this what do we do after that? And I remember Judy Howard saying, oh, don't worry about that. Judy Howard was the Dean of Social Science. 3 years is like infinity in terms of university budgets. Well, I wish it was. It turned out it wasn't. But so that was my first year. Shelly came back and continued this, and then we went into the regular kind of CSD director time and applied for a training grant renewal, got it. Sarah was very much involved with that, and a most important person in guiding both Sarah and me, as Sarah took over as training director and I became director, was a very important person in terms of mentoring me, was Stu Tolnay. He could take an ugly piece of prose and weave it in a particular way to make it much more compelling. And so, yes, that's what I wanted to say. Thank you, Stu. So he's so important. I hope he's going to be around. I don't know how he's doing, but I hope he's going to be around. And so we were successful in getting the grants renewed, and off we went. Then the stimulus money ran out, and we had to do some reorganization of the staff. That was painful and somewhat reminiscent of the moment we're in right now, unfortunately. But yeah. I also realized how important it is to work with really, really good people who trust you and you trust them to make the center work.
We had Stanley Lieberson, Sam Preston, and then Tom Pullum came, and he was a director for the previous 10 years, but he had left a year before, and so there was essentially there was no director when I was there. I think that so I sort of moved into a empty office. I think some visiting fellow was occupying the office because nobody wanted to move into the office, and it was literally vacant. So there was nobody I followed, and I knew of Tom. Over the subsequent years, I became a good friend of his. He had close ties to many people at the university, and came back a few times, and I would go out for lunch with him. The two who were close friends before I became director, and I talked to a great deal, were Stanley Lieberson and Sam Preston. They both they were both informative figures in my career, and I talked to them, I think, before I accepted the job. I did not know, there was an earlier history with Stan Schmidt, and I've learned a great deal about him, and he's going to figure very prominently in my presentation that I'm going to make on at the conference. But I drew no influence from him, and I suppose at the time I kind of poo-pooed it because he was focused on local population estimation, which in my vision at that time I considered less important than many other kinds of things. Now, in my older age, I've a great deal of respect for what Stan Schmidt did, both inventing the center and developing a whole variety of demographic techniques for creating local population estimates, and I'm going to talk at great length about that. But the two people whom I thought very highly of were particularly Stan Lieberson, but also Sam Preston a great deal. So those were the two people whom I wanted to be a successor of. But I also was very familiar with most of the directors of the population centers around the country. If there was one person nationally whom I admired greatly, it was Ron Friedman at the University of Michigan, who he was kind of emblematic of both a great center director, a great scholar, and also somebody who trained lots of extraordinary graduate students. So I wasn't personally close to him, but I had known him a great deal. So these were all people in the field. And if you're in the field of demography and you've been to PA meetings for a number of years, you meet everybody. I mean, it's a small community. And so I knew, the center directors, I think, at all the population centers before I came here. And I would correspond with them from time to time about many issues, everything from writing grant proposals to how do they manage interpersonal situations and so on.
Pete Guest was director, and I was gone the year before I became director, and Pete, I don't know the full story, but I think he just wasn't, has kind of fading away. Wasn't that focused on the center. I don't know how much of this should be in the discussion. I didn't have much interaction with Pete. Who I learned from was Charlie. Charlie's office was downstairs from mine, and I can't tell you how many times a week I would pop in and say, Charlie, what do you think of this? How would you approach this? He was really in many ways sort of a mentor for being a CSDE director. And then when Pete just kind of wasn't very active in the center after I got back, so There wasn't a lot of transfer of knowledge there. It was more from Charlie and from folks who'd been there in the past. Certainly easy answer there, Charlie.
So Bob Plotnick was the director when I came in. I think the things I learned from him were how hard it was to have a vibrant center if you're stuck in a basement without a center grant. It was brutal. And he also helped me understand some of the political conflicts that CSDE was constrained by and how deep the roots of that were. The director that influenced my leadership style most, or at least what I aspired to, I'm not saying I got anywhere near it, but what I would have hoped to have been able to do, I think that director was Sam Preston. He was CSDE's founding director back in the 70s, and I met him when he was the director of the Population Center at the University of Pennsylvania. He went on from there to become dean of their arts and sciences. He was really an amazing scholar, and also someone who cultivated the sense of shared community among demographers in a way that very few people I've ever known have. He was just really good at that. During the half year that I spent there at UPenn in their center, there was a bring your own lunch in the atrium almost every day. Rotating cast of characters from different departments would show up. There were regulars, but it was almost never the same group, right? But there was something every day. Topics of conversation were wide-ranging and free, characterized by this real sense of curiosity in everything, right? Nothing was off limits. And people knew how to disagree without being disagreeable. And I loved that. And I feel, again, it's like we never got our room to do that, right? They had this beautiful atrium they could sit in to do that. And people would just show up, if you don't have to go every day, but you go when you get a chance. And it was so much fun that people wanted to go, right? And I sort of feel like we didn't get a chance to really do that, but I tried to create some sense of community like that. In CSDE when I was director.
So Martina Morris was the director before me, and I've got to say that she had a powerful vision of what CSDE should be in terms of the staffing, the organization, the themes that CSDE was going to pursue. And I think that she, in some sense, created the modern CSDE. I suspect that Bob Plotnick, in fact, was the person that I probably came closer to emulating as a director.
Oh, the wonderful, fabulous Shelly Lundberg, who was a model for kind of calmness and a kind of mentor. She mentored me in a way that I wasn't aware of at the time, but basically was preparing me. She also, at the time in which I was appointed acting director, and when I was moving into becoming full-time director, told me what to be firm on and what to negotiate for in taking up the position and where the bodies were buried. I mean, Shelly was great. She wrote out lists of things which about what to expect at what time of the year. She wrote about she wrote details. Maybe I shouldn't be saying this about what things should be done with the staff. I mean, she was fantastic. Really, really good. And yeah. So ideal. And that was in terms of, I mean, personally, it was a big loss. I mean, I think it's a loss because we lost that prominent labor population economics person from CSDE. But yeah, Shelly Lundberg, good person. Directors, I think Bob. I mean, Bob was a bit like Shelly. He's an economist. I mean, Bob was just, and in large part, Bob, things resonated for me with Bob because Bob was a bit of an outsider. He is not sociology, not core demography by any means, but his work touches on it. And I'm not a sort of a core demographer. I was never really trained formally as a demographer. I got interested in demography through being a population geographer, and I came into it and started going to PAAs and stuff like that. And I always felt that I was never central enough. I talked a bit to Shelly about it, and she always said the same sort of thing. But Shelly didn't bother Shelly at all. But Bob, I think Bob kind of understood, and he gave me that kind of confidence. But also, he provided insight into how to navigate, let's just say, strong personalities, and he's really, really good about things like that. Yeah, good person.
Well, this is kind of a sideways response to that question. I felt that one of the major problems of CSDE was that we didn't have a large funded projects of which there were multiple collaborators on. I think that many of the other centers, they would have these large projects, and a number of the PIs or co-PIs were all working together in collaborative research. And this was true both at most of the universities I had been affiliated with. And we didn't have one. Everybody did sort of their own thing. And so I thought that the one way to do this would be to create a collaborative research project of data collection that would get a lot of people involved in that, and everybody could take the data and do their own scholarship based upon it. So I think this was actually after I was center director, but I think it evolved over this course of this period of time, was to think about a project, a survey of some sort. And one of the projects that that other places had done was surveys of high school students. Bill Schul he was not a demographer, but he was a professor at the University of Wisconsin. And he had found a survey conducted of Wisconsin high school graduates in 1957. And he followed them up over the course of their lives, and other people have as well. They, follow them all the way through retirement. It was a longitudinal study using demographic techniques, but sociological and psychological and all sorts of gerontological theories to be able to test ideas. And I thought Seattle would be an ideal location for something like this because it was different from all the other studies that have been done. We were a multi-ethnic, diverse community on the West Coast. The other studies that have been done locally, they were primarily sort of, Wisconsin, kind of a white Scandinavian origin population, relatively homogeneous. There had been other national surveys done comparing Black and white high school students and their subsequent careers, but there was nothing that represented this wide panorama of substantial Asian communities from all different communities, a Native American community, a Hispanic community, a small but very vibrant African American community as well. So Bob Plotnick, I think he was the director at the time, we got a grant and we had a year-long weekly seminar. And everybody participated trying to think of what was their idea. And the problem is everybody had an idea, but it was their pet idea. There wasn't really coming anything together. And after about a year of everybody talking about it and going off in all their directions, I realized this was not going to happen unless somebody took charge. And I was of the mind saying, okay, well, nobody else is going to do it. I will go ahead and do it. So I applied and got a grant from the Mellon Foundation to start what became the University of Washington High School and Beyond project. This was in the early 2000s. And I put in about 5 co-investigators. Everybody was Bob Plotnick, Dick Morrill from geography. Trying to remember, I think we had about 5 or 6 co-investigators. And we selected a site in Tacoma. And so we interviewed all high school seniors in Tacoma. And we're going to follow them up a year later. Because of funding opportunities, we wound up expanding the study to other school districts and including private schools, and it eventually became about a 5-year project of data collection. And I published a book that came out in 2016, and there are probably a couple of dozen articles. I think the website's still available somewhere. The problem was, instead of trying to link all these different people together, it became more and more my project, which I did, and I had a number of other people who were involved with it. Gunnar Omgren from social work was probably my closest colleague during this time period. Everybody else worked on it for a while, as long as they were getting funding, but then they had other interests that they wanted to pursue, and they sort of went off on other tangents, and not as many people wanted to utilize the data. So I think that was my major contribution to trying to create a research community. I think it was successful, and it became fodder for many graduate students and postdocs to do their research. We developed a lot of research ties. Quite a few students used the data for their PhD doctoral dissertations, but it didn't become institutionalized. It didn't, there was no successor for me being the project director of the program. And right now, most people think, oh, isn't that the project that Charlie organized a number of years ago? It was. I was hoping it was going to, take off like some of the other major research projects that define population centers around the country. But that's where that is.
Yeah, that's right. When I was director, the Battelle folks were involved, and then it grew beyond me, beyond Battelle. I think Shelly probably had a role to play in that, and I realize now that you're affiliates from literally all over the place, and that was another way, I think, having the center become part of arts and sciences as opposed to sociology could intellectually expand. One of the internal events that mattered, and I'm not sure if Adrian would mention this, is that's about the time the Center on Statistics and Social Sciences got started, thanks to Adrian's initiative and some university funding. So the two centers, CSSS and CSD, made a nice pairing. And we could point to them as a major resource when we were looking for center funding and training funding. So that internally, I think, was a big impact that was outside the center. Nationally, I mean, we all remember 911, those of us of a certain age, and I don't remember much of it. I mean, that it had any direct impact on what we did. It may have affected some foreign travel that didn't happen. I don't know. The only thing I remember explicitly was one person we wanted to bring in was Iranian, and he couldn't get a visa the first year, but he got a visa the second year. But this was, it was after 911, but we were nonetheless able, with State Department permission, to bring in quite a few fellows from Muslim countries. We had Sudanese, we had this one Iranian, we had several folks from Pakistan, and it wasn't a problem. It wasn't the problem that it became in later years in our politics.
Yeah, I think they have probably a better idea about that because they're all longstanding Seattle residents. So you can imagine when I got here, I'm thrown into writing the center grant proposal and then thrown into the CFAS proposal. And honestly, I was lucky to know my way home, right? That said, what was clearly happening was Seattle was growing in size and national profile during this time. Microsoft was well established, but Amazon was just taking off. And the Gates Foundation was just being established. So it was kind of a feeling of growth and possibility. And some of the negative side effects, like the housing problems and the traffic, were not a big deal back then. It still felt like a city that was really livable and at least somewhat affordable. Nationally, I mean, the thing that I was most focused on was this was a big time for funded research, and NIH went through a period where they called it their doubling period, where the research budget doubled in size. Mm-hmm. And we hit them at that point. So it was a good time it was a lucky time in some ways to be doing institution building, because there was a fair amount of support for that.
Yeah, what was happening? Well, I mean, the big event was it's hard not to think about the Great Recession and coming along. And it was an example in contradistinction to what's happening now of the ways in which the state can provide awesome support at particular moments, and how it leads to these explosion of scientific potential. And that's what happened. It wasn't a Sputnik moment or a World War II moment, but it certainly had this huge push associated with it. It created opportunities. It wasn't just we had money to hire people, we had all this research money that we could dole out at the time. So that was a big, big thing for me. I think it would have been really grim without it at the time. Regionally, it was, again, it was the state. It's not just the federal government, but also the understanding state government and trying to reach out to the state and winning out in some cases, getting money from the Office of Financial Management and learning that what they did. I wasn't fully aware of it, but I became aware of it. Got money to create the RDC from them for the first 2 years. But understanding what they did in terms of population projections. And Adrian Raftery filled me in that they had taken over something that CSD used to do and that we'd lost. And now Sarah has led an effort to kind of recreate those connections. And I think that is really, really good. But it was really, really hard to sustain that without so they really wanted support from us, and it was really hard to reciprocate the money that they gave us, and I regret that. So that was an important thing at the time, and I'm glad it's kind of flourished since, to a certain extent. Other things going on. I can't really think of anything kind of locally. The regional affiliate thing is important. Not that I didn't know this. You discover geography really is important here. We are kind of alone out here as a big research institution in the Northwest, and so looking for kind of regional affiliates, both for the center, but also for kind of support for the research data center we just don't have big institutions around us. We are the only real game in town. And you have to go at least 200 miles to find another big institution or something like that. And it's kind of hard to then build alliances with other institutions that might benefit from your support. So that was painful. Should have been obvious, but it wasn't.
No, I think probably I think the major changes that have taken place on the national schedule landscape that have influenced locally. Centers are really good at raising money. And so the National Institutes of Child Health and Human Development have had a number of orientations over the last 20, 30 years that have shaped the field. I think there are two particularly important ones. One is interdisciplinarity. So the idea that demography centers ought to be in the Department of Sociology, which is what the atmosphere that I came of age in, that's gone. Its population centers have to be institutionally independent, not a subservient part of a academic discipline. So that has become, and I think that after my time, when I was a director, in de facto, we were an interdisciplinary independent center. We raised more money, did more things across campus than any other unit. But nominally, administratively, we're still within the Department of Sociology. I didn't press to have university independence. But afterwards, I think Bob Plotnick and others sort of said, well, that's a logical extension, so it became that. The other thing is the union between demography and the health sciences. So now demography and the health sciences are kind of grown hand in foot. There were always people who, from the health sciences, and a lot of demographers studying health issues, particularly mortality and morbidity. But it's just, there was so much more funding in the health sciences than there was any other branch of the social sciences that was demography adjacent. A lot of the center of gravity is shifted both nationally and locally to the health sciences, particularly public health, but lots of other areas as well. So the interdisciplinarity and I think the link to health sciences, both of which originated nationally, but it's certainly clearly reflected locally as well. I would like also to think the international, demography moving from a study of American society to study of the world, that had its day, but it's kind of contracted a little bit in recent years. And I could go on and on about that, but I think that's another issue. Graduate students and alumni, I think that's I think the center, this anniversary will sort of be a test of that. In other words, it's designed to bring back a lot of the PhDs and maybe some of the postdocs here who got their training, a generation ago, and to see what they have done with their careers. And if the center has been successful, they're all going to be thriving, and they're going to be proud of their origins and how they've tried to take the University of Washington ideals that they learned here and how they've implemented them in their careers and their universities. So we'll wait and see. But I think that's a legacy of anything. Of course, there's all the stuff that's in the library too, all of the publications that people have done. But I think it's the living legacy of our alumni that should be the primary test of whether we've mattered.
I do think a foundational one was moving it out of sociology and beginning the broadening. It broadened with that very early recruiting initiative, but it just kept going. And it became such a vibrant place. And with all the software and, software consulting opportunities and the grant support, all the services, it brought in people who could fall under the broad umbrella of social demography, especially, and could benefit from it. So I know a bunch of folks from social work eventually became involved. More folks from public policy got involved, and say the public health folks and probably others that I don't even aware of. And as you mentioned, the fact that the external affiliates became such a major part of the center rather than just 5 or 6 of them. I think of it as one of the highlights of my career. I think of it as something I worked really hard at. It was sometimes exhausting because I was really split into, I had 2 masters, right? I had the arts and sciences and I had public policy. And public policy, I think, sometimes felt that they weren't getting their fair share of me because I had an office in CSDE and spent a lot of time there. So there were those kind of tensions. But I grew greatly intellectually. I made good friends and colleagues that I still like to see, and that's I think the legacy to me.
Well, from my perspective, again, given when I got there, I would say moving CSDE from a unit in the Department of Sociology to a freestanding unit in the Division of Arts and Sciences was really key. It's had exactly the impact that was intended, which is great. And I think we really want to acknowledge the foresight of the deans of that era. And I want to give a particular shout out to Susan Jeffords, who I think really had a good part of the vision for that. I would say it has a legacy of supporting nationally and globally recognized collaborative interdisciplinary research that makes contributions at every level from theoretical to applied.
My sense is I think the major thing that I've seen happen at CSDE is a really dramatic broadening of the scientific perspectives that CSDE incorporates. And so during my experience at CSDE, it's gone from being simply a group within the sociology department to being a really large center that incorporates public health, policy, social work, anthropology, the array of disciplinary perspectives that are incorporated in CSDE is really immense. And I think that has been mirrored at what's gone on in population centers around the country. And perhaps demography more broadly is a much bigger and more expansive and more diverse field than it used to be. Maybe the main direction in which it's moved is towards biology and health. I think the spatial aspect is sort of another, methodological issue that's been major. But I think that the expansion into public health, biological anthropology and so on has been really remarkably distinctive, and I think has characterized demography more broadly as a field.
What changes? I'm not really sure. I mean, I think it's strong support from throughout the years, a strong commitment from the college to the center. And strategic decisions by the center in response to that support to demonstrate the centrality of what the services the center provides for a wide range of people, both faculty and graduate students, but also a wider community. There were certain decisions made before even CSDE moved into its current home in Wright Hall about leveraging student technology fee money to create servers that that demographers, anybody who had a demographic interest, including students, and we got looser and looser about that to get more money over time, to create these, first of all, just only Windows-based terminal servers. That was a big decision made when Bob Plotnick was still chair, and it was pre-Matt Weatherford days. We had this real interest in creating a social science research infrastructure. I remember very much that when I came here from UCLA, the quality of computing infrastructure for social science research was appallingly bad. And people pointed to labs with desktop computers, or there were university IT or the equivalent thereof, where they had big mainframes. And there was nothing in between, even though it's possible to get these small servers and house them locally. And so we began this process of basically trying to create a poor man's version of UCLA's social science computing. I don't think anybody's ever really talked about this. That's what we did. And I can't remember the fellow's name who I worked with, who was basically in charge of CSD's computing at the time. But he put in grants and we got these first terminal servers. And it built from there. When Martina became director, she got Linux boxes and we expanded the terminal servers, and CSD's computing became really, really good. And it's central to so many people's research now. And that has been, that technology fee, it got to be that it was so good, nobody was noticing what we were doing at first, and we didn't talk about it because we thought somebody would, in the college or somebody else, would start to say something. We tried to fly under the radar, and at some point the college started to notice and started to say, "What are you doing?" And I said, "Well, we need these resources for our research." We didn't talk about the way we were going to basically create this parallel computing infrastructure that was being provided at the university level. Anyway, that was a big thing. And I'm so grateful that at various moments when the college could have stepped in, various people didn't do stuff and stop us. They did provide support. They grumbled at the salaries we had to pay. They grumble about that still, I think, but we're now so big, it's never going to go away. Because if it went away, research would stop. So that is, I think I played a little part in that, in basically pushing, because of my experience at UCLA. Like, where is the computing infrastructure here? And once it started, and especially with Martina's push post Bob Plotnick, it just took off. There was a lot of skepticism from some established CSDE people at the time. Like, why are we doing this? Why do we need this? I mean, some of the more senior people, thinking that they could do everything they wanted to do on their desktop, or they would just, use some central university resource. They didn't realize the potential for building something superior to either of those that we controlled. And yeah, I mean, that was a big thing. And I'm glad the college, in a way, this is where UW's awful decentralization and chaotic decentralization actually paid off, in the sense that there was nobody to step in. We weren't stepping on anybody's toes. There was a big kind of wide open field in front of us, and at some point somebody started to notice, you're spending all this money on salaries and on infrastructure. You're winning the most awards from SCF because you have the most compelling proposals, because you're adding the most value. At some point, the dean of research in social sciences, Primojeski, started saying, "What are you doing?" They started to notice, because basically we were becoming more powerful than they were. See, God, that makes, I'm not that old. I mean, your legacy. Well, I mean, fantastic research. I mean, the thing that the students, the trainees, the people have gone on to have incredible careers, who are very influential. There's that. I think about where we are truly, I think, one of the premier locations in the world for particular types of demographic research. The thing that it's really pushed me, statistical demography. I mean, and working with colleagues in that area in particular, the unfortunate loss of Emilio. I mean, Emilio taught me a lot. He's such a humble person, but also serving on committees of people doing statistical demography work, often with Adrian, but not exclusively Adrian as chair, Adrian Raftery, learning a lot about that. We're so influential in those areas, and continuing that, I think, is really important. So, and really how we've become so, from back in 2000, 2001, when we didn't have a center grant, we're now so prominent at PAAs. I mean, it's an incredible story, and it's a reflection of the work done in the center, that's for sure, and the successive directors, each building on the previous one. But it's also, I think, I have to say, despite all the grumbling that has come from the college, it's a reflection of college support. And I surely hope that that continues, even in this most difficult time we're in right now. And of course, I'm not even speaking about what happens at NIH, but it has been an incredible success story. So much so that colleagues of mine at other places have been, I'm mentioning UCLA and Penn State in particular. They say things like, how do you keep growing? They even in a more well-funded institutional environment like University of California, I think we've done well relative to them. So I'm so proud of that. That is blood, sweat, and tears, but also it's money, and it's a sign of our collective success. I don't think it's any individual is responsible for that, and that we work well together. Not to say there haven't been difficult personalities. And so far, everybody's managed to navigate those reasonably well without things falling apart, as they sometimes do in the academic world.
It sort of sounds that, I mean, the kind of question sort of is kind of the question that could be asked of any field and of any topic. I think the primary mark of a scholar is hard work. Not all, moments in life are public events where you're celebrated. Most of the time you're sitting there staring at, I guess what used to be your pad and pencil, but now it's, your computer screen, and you're trying to understand some naughty problem, and you got to do all kinds of analyses and talk to a bunch of people and try one thing or another to try to solve these puzzles. But a lot of times that's more likely to be failure than success. I mean, success will come, maybe, but along the way, you're going to have lots of heartache and disappointment and everything else. And so you have to be dedicated. The life of a scholar, demography included, is not for the faint-hearted. You're not going to go from one celebrated moment to the next celebrated moment. You're going to have a lot of disappointments and ups and downs in your career, and you have to kind of believe in what you're doing and be willing to work hard, not for 6 months to finish the dissertation, but for 10, 20, 30 years to be able to keep your nose to the grindstone. And it's often a very lonely kind of pursuit. Even if you're collaborating with other people, you've got to sit down and rework your ideas, and sometimes say that I've been following a path for a long time and it isn't working out. I've got to figure out something else to do. That's sort of the individual advice to individual scholars. To the collective enterprise of population research centers is that other people are more important than you are. Most people, particularly if they haven't had a lot of experience in the population field, they feel that institutions and individuals are one and the same. What can I do to make the center reflect me? What can I do to have the center be an extension of all of my pet ideas? And that is basically a road to ruin. No center worth its salt is going to be a reflection of one person. And if you just do a simple analysis of the people who have had long careers as being a director of the center, those might have had a lively beginning, but they became stale after a while because you kind of run out of ideas. And so the good idea of a center director is to help other people establish their careers, promote them, and all of your good ideas and suggestions, those will probably be forgotten, and they need to be forgotten because the center is a collective enterprise, not something that's going to reflect one person, no matter how brilliant they are.
Do I have any sage advice to offer? I guess my main advice is to maintain a willingness to work, to draw on other disciplines, to be multidisciplinary. It may not be in your own short-term professional interest to publish in journals that aren't your own, so to speak. But in the long run, you'll find it intellectually quite broadening and energizing. It really varies. Some folks like it. Some folks are just hardcore economists. They do great economics. That's all they do. They never look outside. There's a role for that, but there's also the role for folks like us, like me, and others that bridge disciplines and do some work that you otherwise probably wouldn't get done because you and your co-author or co-authors look at the world differently, and you come to an agreement, but it's an agreement that neither of you would have come to on your own.
Yeah, that's a hard one. I think the challenges ahead are going to be existential, really, for this little niche of ours. Without center grant funding, CSDE can't offer the kind of research and training support it's been doing for the past 20 years. And the future of the whole center grant funding system at NIH is uncertain right now. Mm-hmm. Funding prospects for individual researchers are equally dire. even senior faculty with established programs are having their grants terminated from one day to the next. So it must be terrifying for the next generation of demographers who are now entering the workforce. It's a really difficult period we're moving into. And I don't think anybody really knows exactly how bad. It can get really bad. I mean, it's clear it can get really bad. We don't know how bad it's going to get, but it's not going to be easy. And the university as a whole is going to be reeling from this with the indirect cost cut and all the other, like the whole medical school and public health. I don't even know how they're going to exist, to tell you the truth. So it's, yeah, existential.
And I think that, as I've already implied, I think that one of the main contributions of pop centers and CSDE in particular is a recognition that this is a service to researchers, and to keep that in mind, that it's not an organization that has a specific scientific mission of its own, is supportive of the missions and the training that other researchers want to engage in.
Words of advice. Celebrate the good times, because there will be bad times. Stay in the research, and when there are financial issues, try and stay in the work as much as possible. I mean, when there were difficult fiscal decisions to be made and reorganizations, being in the CSD seminar and seeing people deliver their work, especially the students, just lifted me out of a foul mood. Seriously. And it made all that difficult work seem completely worthwhile. So yeah, that's a piece of advice I would give. You can get lost in the budgets and in personnel issues and conflicts and cuts, and they can be devastating. But you can be lifted out of that, not wholly, but by the work that we do, and how important it is.